Trevor Manuel. He holds the record as the country's longest ever serving Minister of Finance and is also the luminary who shaped the South African economic policy post-1994. But today, South Africa finds itself on the precipice of economic stagnation, high unemployment, rising COVID-19 cases, corruption, and the weakening of state institutions. Well, Mr. Manuel joins me now to discuss these important matters. Mr. Manuel, thank you very much for talking to us, coming to us live from Cape Town. I'd like to start off with the challenge that faces the country right now, and that is the third wave that is sweeping through the country, and in particular, the acting Minister of Health saying that the Delta variant, which was first discovered in India, is actually quite dominant, not just here, but in 85 other countries in the world. Firstly, Mr. Manuel, why is South Africa finding itself in the grips of a third wave, in your considered view?
Good afternoon to you and all your viewers, Collie, and thanks for the opportunity to have a discussion about this matter. Look, I think that the big challenge with COVID is that the message about the nature of the enemy has not found resonance with the majority of South Africans. And so we've heard the story about what's happening in Zanzibar today, where people don't mask up, there's no social distance, and we understand that social distance also a function of the amount of space that people have or are used to. But our communication is not getting through to South Africans, because I kind of hope that the President this evening will speak in every language. We have 11 official languages, and we must talk to our people and reach them, not in sort of complex technical language, but it must be broken down so people understand that ultimately, regardless of how good it's the actions of people that make a very substantial trying people, or even just relying on the vaccine, and that is the area where I think we're failing rather badly as a nation, not as the government, but as a nation.
Yeah. Tonight, Mr. Manuel, there is the anticipation that the president is going to announce much tighter restrictions. First of all, if he does announce such, will this yield the desired effect? Because we know that with tighter restrictions, then in comes law enforcement, and they're usually also helped by the South African military. You've already expressed reservations around this to say they have been ineffective when we saw them come into play last year. Is this going to get the desired effect in your view?
My sense of it, Collie, is that we may have to depend on them, but we need to depend on police and military more as kind of monitors capable of explaining to people why they should not act like they're acting. I didn't think that we saw nearly enough of that last year. And you've seen other jurisdictions where the armed forces play a very different role, an educational role, and that is what I hope we will see, depending on the nature of the announcement this evening. I'm also hoping that the President will try and clamp down on gatherings of all kinds, legal or illegal, and certainly where people, the places where people gather to hang out should all be shut down. We'll catch up with life again, but we can't catch up once people are dead. Yeah. And that is a big issue. We're seeing shutdowns in a number of countries. Sydney in Australia is just shut down as well. And there have been a number of countries where they've actually introduced short-term circuit breakers. And if people respond to this, then you prevent the spread of the virus. And I think that, notwithstanding my views about the Defence Force at the start of the lockdown in March last year, we were able to save many lives as a consequence.
Yeah. The concern here, Mr. Manuel, is that the President, yes, is going to announce these strict measures, and in all probability we are going to become a police state one more time. And I say that with all the humility, if you will. But the problem here is that you have a very senior leader of the governing party, to which the president belongs, whose case was heard this week. Large numbers were seen outside court. Those numbers encouraged by some members of the very party that you belong to, the ANC. Then on Friday came the EFF with the hordes of people that went to the offices of SAPRA. What consequences have there been for people leading these marches? Because that's where South Africans really lose it with government.
Look, I think that we're too lax on people who misbehave, consciously so. And as for the unnamed person about whom there was a court case, but not in the court where the protest happened, I mean, I only wish that that individual had read the Constitution of the African National Congress and seen the section that deals with the character of the ANC. It's Rule 3 if he's lost about this thing. And he will know that his behavior is entirely unbecoming. As for the EFF and their march against SAPRA, SAPRA is not a political organization, can't be a political organization. I think every individual, regardless of their political persuasion, must trust the scientific evaluation that SAPRA does on vaccines, because vaccines, once they're taken, must protect people. And you can't just demand that they approve vaccines that have not been tested, for which they have no data. It's ludicrous. It'll destroy everything. It's like Donald Trump saying, oh, well, people can drink bleach because that's okay. SAPRA must counter that with science, and that's what they're trying to do, and you can't move them politically. And I'm very glad that SAPRA stood its ground in the face of the behavior of the EFF, which I think is reckless and immature.
Yeah. As I wrap up this discussion around COVID-19, Mr. Manuel, I can't miss the important balance that's got to be struck. Again, that dominant phrase, balancing lives and livelihoods. The president anticipated to lock down the country, perhaps. In your view, what should he say?
I'm hoping that he will focus on gatherings and places of hangout. That, I think, is the easiest. I think that people would like to work, and I hope that the modes of public transport, like taxis, commit, because frequently one drives past taxis and people aren't wearing masks. I'm told that there aren't sanitizers in taxis any longer. These become important issues, and perhaps one of the moves that the country would have to go through is that taxi drivers and people involved in public transport should be moved up the ranks of those who are vaccinated earlier, and they must become messengers to prevent the spread of the disease. Those are the kinds of things which I think we have to do early and loudly in every language. And I'm hoping that South Africans will hear that they have a role to play in preventing the spread of the virus.
On the vaccine front, you were speaking recently at a webinar hosted by the Economic Development Center for Development, and you said there that this has been a quote-unquote complex space, and you're saying this with a measure of experience because you're part of this, what is called the AU Envoys Group, and I suspect it's got to do with this COVAX facility in which South Africa is a part. Is there something that you can share with us that has not been shared publicly about the complexity of acquiring these vaccines? Because it's part of why we are here in this third wave, that we have not had vaccines.
Well, I think it's important to be fair in the way in which we look at these issues. The first tests that were run in South Africa were the AstraZeneca Oxford tests, and a lot of those tests were run with the alpha wave primarily in South Africa. And then came the beta wave, and it was discovered that the AstraZeneca is no longer effective. Also, the AstraZeneca vaccines were going to be brought in from the Indian Serum Institute, and India then prohibited any export of vaccines. So we were caught in a bind because we placed a lot of trust in being able to get those vaccines in. We then moved on to Pfizer, and Pfizer, I think, is caught up. Pfizer and Moderna are caught up because the wealthy countries of the north are acting in the most unbelievably nationalist way. And they're not looking at the needs of everybody. And amongst the big challenges is the campaign to ensure that there's a waiver on intellectual property rights so that the vaccines can be manufactured everywhere, and vaccine availability then is seen as a global public good, because nobody will be safe until the maximum number of people have been vaccinated. And I think that is one of the challenges. 2 weeks ago, this matter was put into the room in Cornwall in the UK at the meeting of G7. And while some G7 leaders, including President Biden and President Macron, have committed to this, the G7 as a group won't commit to the waiver, and that is a fundamental problem. And this places us in a situation, and you've heard President Biden commit to availing many millions of doses next year, but next year would be too late. We need to be able to manufacture the vaccines on the African continent, and that's a battle that is still ongoing. And we've seen that with the Aspen manufacturing plant in Gqeberha, they had a setback because at a plant where Johnson & Johnson were manufacturing vaccines in Baltimore in the United States, that plant was contaminated, and the product that was sent, or part of the product sent to South Africa then, was deemed to be vaccinated, and millions of doses had to be destroyed, and that has been a major setback for us. You know, I don't know that we were right at the front of the queue always in trying to secure the vaccines, but I think that there were also a number of issues countering the availability of vaccines across the African continent. And so we find ourselves in this battle still. The schedules now seem to suggest that the inflow of vaccines is more frequent and more regular, and hopefully this will get up and running now.
All right. Final analysis, therefore, your overall assessment of the handling of this pandemic, both at government level and at business level, because they were introduced fairly early on in the country's response to this pandemic. What's been your assessment? I'm not sure we can talk about successes, but you be the judge. Have we been successful at all, or has it been a complete failure?
Holly, I think that the point of failure is that people don't understand that it's our own action. You know, there's the words of a reggae song, none but ourselves can free our minds. And I think that people must understand that it's dependent on them, on each one of us, and our behavior to limit the spread of the virus. And that's the message that isn't getting through. And perhaps it's because there's too much techno-babble spoken. Perhaps it's all in highfalutin English. Perhaps we've got to break this thing down and communicate with people in all of the languages that they understand. And then I think perhaps the message will land differently. But the spread continues, and the battle I think you're seeing now in provinces like Gauteng, where I'm told that you can't have a hospital bed for love or money. It's an unbelievably difficult situation. We'd seen it on television as it unfolded in places like Brazil and India, but now it's become what's happening in South Africa. And so it's the action by people, by families, by communities that can stop the spread. And you know, government can help, but it's individuals that have to take the appropriate action, and that's behavioral change we need.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I don't know, Mr. Manuel, if I agree with you completely. Yes, I agree that the actions are individual behaviors that we have to observe, but I think you're being very, very lenient on government. If you look at the screaming headlines in the city press today where they're saying Gauteng is going to look like India, I don't think that we want to even contemplate that. But let's pause for the moment. We're going to take a short breather. When we return, we continue the conversation with Trevor Manuel, and we're going to talk building a capable state. They are in conversation with Trevor Manuel. He is the country's former finance minister, and in recent times he is a business leader. Well, we are talking building a capable state, and this is one subject that is close to your heart, Mr. Manuel, because at a recent event, as I've been pointing out, you have spoken at length about what you think is wrong with the current state. I want to use the example of the handling of this COVID-19 pandemic and use that as a launch pad to ask you how far you think we are from achieving a capable state, or are we regressing even further?
Ollie, it's a fundamentally important question. You know, when we drafted the National Development Plan, we took as a starting point the Constitution, and especially the preamble to our Constitution. There's a clause in the preamble that commits governments into the future to raise the living standards of all citizens and to free the potential of each person. It's a big commitment, but it has to be measured. How do you say to somebody, last year you lived in a shack, in an informal settlement, we now have you in a house, but we have to continue to improve your living standards. That's what we must work towards. And that's the developmental side. And the other side of it is that you must be capable in what you want to do. Government must be abundantly clear and capable in what it's doing. Now, there are some issues. And the broad measure of what we need to do as a country is to ensure that we can deal with poverty, inequality, and unemployment on a continuous basis. So this won't happen of itself. It needs determined actions, and those actions, I think, are what's needed. And my sense of it is that you can kind of draw up a balance sheet and say, what are the first things we need to do? Now, you know, for instance, local government is so fundamentally important to us. And just this past week, the Auditor General released the audit for local government, and it's abysmal. It's abysmal. Like 8% or less than 8% of local governments in South Africa get a clean audit. So it means that all of the money being poured into local government is not being properly accounted for. And therefore, if you don't deal with that, we're not going to see our everyday lives improve, because local government is responsible for what we see and feel every day, whether we have roads, whether we have clean water, whether our water treatment plants work, whether there are sports fields for our children. All of these issues that relate to quality of life are destined to be managed by local government in the Constitution. And there are instances of local government, especially in the Eastern Cape, Northwestern Free State, where for a number of years, these municipalities have not even been able to produce financial statements to be audited. Now, why are we tolerant of that? And similarly, you know, the situation in provinces, in some of the provinces, and some of the departments in some provinces, not much better, and then at national government level. So I think that as a nation, we must grow increasingly intolerant of the quality of decision-making in governments. And there are some issues that must be dealt with quite urgently. And the first of those, I think, is what we called stabilizing the political administrative interface. the Constitution and the Public Finance Management Act set out distinct and discrete roles for ministers and DGs at national level, ditto at province and so on. So ministers aren't DGs, they have different roles. But ministers seem to step in and take over the responsibility of DGs. And because you've destroyed the quality of public service, ministers have also then appointed friends and associates in very senior positions, and so we don't have the quality of public services or public service that the country needs, because we should be a fairly large economy. We should be able to render good services to people, but we can't do that because we've ignored what needs to happen. In the consequence, I think what you're seeing in a country like South Africa, Collie, is that people who are better off can pay for their own services. Many of us have private health care through medical aids. Many of us have send our children to private schools. Many of us have security in the communities where we live, and so are less dependent on the police. But poor people don't have those kinds of choices. So the cleavage between rich and poor is growing in leaps and bounds, and I think that speaks to the incapability of the state in all three spheres, and that state must serve the people of this country. And that I think is a deep tragedy, because we've seen this thing in Zimbabwe, for instance, 20 years ago, and the elite continued with their normal lives. Poor people skipped across the border into South Africa, sometimes into Mozambique, and so on. There's nowhere for poor South Africans to go, and so all that you'll have is a pent-up demand, and you're seeing this every day. In the form of service delivery protests in a number of towns and cities across the country. And it's a deep tragedy. It's going to blow somewhere. And I think it speaks to the fact that area of capable state, which starts with the political administrative interface, is not adequately treated. Similarly, I think that there are many people in the public service who are not doing anything. There are departments in various provinces that have become bloated with people who don't add any value, and you've got to take these people out of the system so that the government is better able to remunerate people who are making a difference.
All right.
But I think similarly, colleagues, just let me use the last example. Just look at the hospitals in and around Johannesburg. The fact that Charlotte Macleke burnt, the fact that the fire engines couldn't get there, and the fact that the fire doors weren't working speaks to deep incompetence that exists in the relevant departments. And it's the management of the hospital, it's the management of the Provincial Department of Health, but more importantly, it's the management of the Provincial Department of Works. It's the same department. You saw this at the Bank of Lisbon building before. There doesn't seem to be the interest or capability in maintaining buildings utilized by important departments in the province. And this is something that we can't live with. Yeah. Similarly, if you look at Helen Joseph and Rema Musa hospitals, how do you have hospitals running out of water? It is in Johannesburg. This is not in some far-flung Kobo or something like that. This is in the largest city in our country. How do you have this happen? Yeah. And why don't we arrest the situation?
All right. So what you're going to do here, Mr. Manuel, is get me fired for allowing you to speak for so long without challenging you. So here we go. And I need you to really give me quicker responses in this regard.
Okay.
You have built a reputation for, confronting issues head on. So I hope you're going to be just as candid in the next flow of questions. You've talked about ministers who blur the line between their responsibilities as politicians and want to also be DGs at the same time. I just want to ask you this overriding question first, very quickly. Do you think President Ramaphosa, right now as things stand, he has a fit-for-purpose cabinet?
No.
Okay.
You want a short answer? Give me.
That's perfect. So let me start with the power situation, which is the biggest threat to economic recovery right now. And I want to talk about the energy minister. Do we have a capable minister there?
You know, this thing has taken so long. We now have agreed on 100 megawatts. Do you know how long it's taken? I read the President's Economic Advisory Council's report dated October, and one of the things that they stated clearly, October 2020, before the SONA this year, the issues of licensing, of embedded generation, et cetera, should be clarified. It was clarified recently, and the regulations are still to be passed. Now, if we don't listen to evidence, we will never succeed as a country, because you can't just have individuals trying to determine what they want to decide on regardless of consequence.
Crime and corruption. I want to take this conversation there now. Crime and corruption. The police minister. And I want to extend that question to the head of the NPA. Do we have capable individuals in this regard?
You know, ultimately, the criminals are not going to be caught by the minister, Cele, regardless of how tough he is or how tough he talks. You need competent police, a competent police service with all of the appropriate organs in play. You need good forensics. You need the ability to prepare cases for court. You need to measure the success. And you need a police service that is also committed to dealing with criminality. One of the deep tragedies in our country, Collie, is that the greatest levels of crime are between poor people, between poor black people. And you can look at a number of years, station after station, the places where there's the highest homicide rates are in poor communities, and this matter is tolerated. That's what must be dealt with. It's not the minister, it's the commissioner, the provincial commissioners, and the systems at play.
Yeah.
And that is what I'm not seeing. You know, I take as a measure, Collie,
yeah.
the murder of Senzo Meiwa. 7 people in a house, and they haven't been able to find a murderer. How does it happen? It's not a needle in a haystack. This is an abundantly clear situation. It reflects poorly on the police service of South Africa.
Well, and I picked this ministry in part because you spoke about the police ministry and you spoke about the police minister, whom you said he does not seem to understand his role as a politician and the role of the police commissioner, who is the DG in the police ministry. Is Minister Cele, does he deserve to still be there? Let me be clear about this question.
Look, there are unresolved matters. I mean, you know, a few months ago, there was a suggestion that the president was going to call out Commissioner Sithole on something, and the commissioner asked for time. And it relates to some bad decisions that were taken ahead of the Nasrec conference of the ANC that seem to have drawn Commissioner Sithole into. Now, these matters must be resolved. If the commissioner is not fit for purpose, then they must replace him with a set of commissioners who are fit for purpose, who have the requisite skills in policing, and who will be adjudged according to their managerial skills for putting in place all of the systems. And I've run through some of the systems that the police require.
Yeah. Shamila Batoy, is she fit for purpose?
Look, the interesting challenge is I don't know what sits inside the National Directorate of Public Prosecutions. You'd seen these long hold-ups and more recently responses, especially on corruption. is the institution, because what had happened over a period of a decade in the country is that so many of the necessary institutions were debased. I looked at the tenure of former President Zuma, and you look at the key institutions within the greater criminal justice system, they were all debased. The police service, how many commissioners were there in the police service, and what impact did that have, especially on issues like, the ANC demanded that the Scorpions be replaced. It was a terrible decision by a political party. It was replaced by Dipsy or the Hawks. And look at how many leaders the Hawks have had, and look at the disaster. And so you don't have the elite unit that can deal with crime as it should. And I think more recently you've seen the name escapes me.
Yeah.
Stepping up to the fore, but the prosecutorial authority was weakened. Do you remember how many heads of the NPA there were within the tenure of President Zuma? Similarly, in the intelligence service, and you don't have to believe me. You can look at the issues that were raised at the Zondo Commission and all of these matters to understand that good people have been removed, and now bad people must still be removed and the institutions rebuilt.
All right.
We don't have the time for it, but there must be an urgency about how we deal with these matters, because what we're living through cannot be tolerated for much longer.
Former Finance Minister Trevor Manuel, who is a businessman in nowadays, but we're reflecting on some of the work that is being done in government as someone who has the experience in being very senior at government level. Mr. Manuel, one of the ministries that I cannot not ask you about is that of state-owned enterprises. And they continue to be a resources drainer, which is contrary to what they were built for. Is Minister Pravin Gordhan turning around these institutions successfully, or has he himself become an impediment?
No, I don't think that Minister Gordhan is turning around these institutions, unfortunately. The big issue about state-owned enterprises is to understand that, firstly, many of them have their own legislation and they have to follow the prescripts of the Companies Act. So if you're sitting in Eskom, you're appointed, the board of Eskom should be paramount. It must oversee and it must ensure that there's governance of what happens within the corporation, and if it's split into three, each of those entities would be required to explain, and the board must oversee the governance. And the minister, I think, his role ends as a shareholder. He doesn't come into the boardroom. He can't dictate what happens there. Mm-hmm. And this is not quite what I've seen. In a different time, state-owned enterprises all operated of the strength of their own balance sheets. Mm-hmm. Now, each one of them has been badly debased, and I think much of what Judge Zondo sits with every single day is the extent of their debasement, because the bulk of the corruption happened in the large state-owned enterprises. But notwithstanding that, I think it's fundamentally important to understand what the legislation requires in respect of ministerial responsibility, board responsibility, and executive responsibility within these corporations. And I think if you don't have that properly fixed, you're going to trip over yourself time without number, and that I think is the issue. And let me just go into another a pet project. You can't have something called the deployment committee decide who sits on these boards. You must have competence on the boards, and those boards must be incorruptible, and they must be true to purpose, and that's what we're not seeing in South Africa. I still see that there are boards that have procurement committees. Now, nowhere in the private sector will boards perform executive functions.
Yeah. All right.
Boards must stay out of those kinds of things. And I'd seen just recently in respect of the ESCOM board on oil that the board was involved in this process. It has to be wrong in every description of the Companies Act.
All right. Very briefly for me, let's talk the economy and what it's going to take to turn it around. But before that, I'm hoping that the team has this soundbite ready for me. It's the former president, Thabo Mbeki, talking about what is needed in order to turn the economy around. If we have that soundbite, can we just play it quickly, please?
The social partners led by government have an absolute responsibility to the millions of our people urgently to work together to produce and implement the said reconstruction and recovery plan. And here I mean a plan, not a vision, important as the latter might be. And in this regard, they must be guided by what Kosatu said, namely that organized labor's approach is based upon a social compact where all the parties from government to labor, business and society make a contribution and, when necessary, a sacrifice for the sake of the national interest.
The former president there, Mr. Manuel, part of what I thought or I would have wanted him to get into, unfortunately, I think that part is not in there, is about a plan versus vision. And I think that's what he said some time ago is lacking as far as trying to revive the economy is concerned. Do you agree with him that all we have right now is something of a vision and not a plan?
I agree with former President Mbeki, but, you know, he's not alone in that. I think that the President's Economic Advisory Council in that report in October also dealt with these issues. When I look at the work that was done in the course of the latter part of 2020 by the social partners, Business for South Africa actually provided a lot of detail into the process. And if you read the statement that the Thabo Mbeki Foundation made on this issue, they refer to this at some length. Now, sector by sector, what the potential is and how you need to drive to get there. And I think it's this that moves beyond the generalities into the specifics of stimulating growth. Along the same trend line, the President's Economic Advisory Council, for instance, looks at public finances, and they talk about what places a drain on public finances, and this is what they say. The public sector wage bill, the debt service costs, and the number of people on social grants. They say that there are 16 million people on grants and 10 million people working and paying taxes. And clearly there is an imbalance that can't be sustained. And they say because of those kinds of expenditures, the government can't spend on infrastructure to unleash future potential growth. And I think it's getting into these kinds of details that are important. I like the work that the Operation Vulindlela, which sits across the National Treasury and the Presidency, is doing in this regard, but they need to be heard more volubly about the urgency of the issues. And one of the issues where they come out early in the process was on embedded generation. But there are a number of other issues. Take the questions of water and sanitation. And if we want to create greater employment, we must have the resources available to spend on that kind of infrastructure. Doing so will also bring into play the number of unemployed engineers in this country.
All right.
And it isn't necessary to find engineers outside of South Africa, because South African civil engineering has always been phenomenally strong and has represented the country well elsewhere on this continent and abroad from that. And we don't want to use these skills, and that's our problem, and that's why we're not building a public service with the necessary technical skills. These issues all add up together.
Mr. Manuel.
The key issue is, what are we going to do to unleash economic development?
Mr. Manuel, I think that's the right place to leave it. Way over time, but thank you very much for allowing us time to talk to you at at this stage of our lives in the country and indeed the state of the economy. That has been the former Finance Minister, Trevor Manuel. It is